So yeah, I'd like to also respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners here in Brisbane, Mianjin, the Yuggera people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. The image you see here is of the Brisbane River where I live, and it's known locally as Maiwa. So I'll take a moment to acknowledge the deep and enduring connection that the Yuggera people have to this country, and I extend this respect to all First Nations people from the lands you're coming from today. So, as Robert mentioned, I'm an educational researcher and evaluator working at the New South Wales Department of Education, obviously working interstate right now. And today we'll be exploring how realist thinking can be used to enrich different frameworks and models from implementation science. And I'll just check one more time, Robert. Everything coming through perfectly? Great, thanks. So my aim today is really a persuasive one, and I'll be making the case for the value of theory, actually. By theory, I mean something quite specific. From a realist perspective, programs as collections of resources, equipment, and personnel are known as theories incarnate. They're always based on a hypothesis that postulates if we deliver a program in this way, or we manage services like so, then it will bring about some improved outcome. In other words, programs are practical manifestations of certain beliefs and assumptions. And these beliefs could be based on anything. They could be based on trust, on leadership style, on norms and social pressure. They just need to be fully articulated. They need to be built into what Justin Jagosh calls the program architecture so that we can test and evaluate them. My aim today is to show why theory is essential for designing, implementing, and evaluating programs. So before we begin, I think it's really important that we bring some conceptual clarity to what we'll be discussing today. And this is not the only way to organize these key ideas within implementation and evaluation, but I think it's a very useful one. At the beginning, or so first, we would have the innovation, number one, which would be the policy, intervention, or set of practices being implemented. Two would be the organization, which is usually seen as the system or setting into which the innovation or the intervention is being introduced. And I'm going to be using innovation and intervention interchangeably here, but because the implementation science frameworks prefer innovation, I'll use innovation from here on. Three, we have the implementation process, which is the set of deliberate activities and strategies used to embed and integrate the innovation into the organization. And then we have the evaluation, which is the systematic investigation of how, why, and to what extent the intervention and its implementation achieve intended outcomes. So I think what's really important is we think of all four things: the innovation, the organization, the implementation strategy, and the evaluation, all part of the larger program architecture. And by program, I'm using program in the realist sense. They're all connected. And there's a few reasons why this is so important, but maybe the simplest way to approach this is imagine you've got an innovation that is really good. So it has a clear causal theory, but it actually does what it says it should, but the implementation strategy fails. From an evaluation perspective, we need to be able to have clarity about which parts of our program architecture are doing what. We could have a great innovation, but things could fall down at the implementation side of things. The other thing is that the evaluation itself, especially if it's a responsive evaluation, that is also part of the program architecture because it could be feeding insights into the development and improvement of a given program. And so the curious thing is that you could have an evaluation that's just not suited for your investigative problems. You know, I work in schools, I work in complex settings, often with complex innovations that need complex implementation strategies, working within complex organizations, in fact, complex systems. And your evaluation approach needs to be, really on point. There'd be a strong argument to make that experimental designs wouldn't be suited to investigating that level of complexity. And we can discuss some of the reasons why a little bit later, but you need to be very careful about your evaluation. And the point here is that all four things actually have a causal theory behind them. Today, we'll be exploring theories related to a key strategy within implementation science, namely adaptation. And if we look to frameworks like the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Science, it's defined as the process of modifying an innovation, or perhaps even an organization, to improve its fit and integration into local systems. As you'll see, it's the theory behind why we adapt programs that really matters. And to make things even more complex, we're often adapting multiple things at once. We could be adapting innovations, we could be adapting implementation strategies, we could be adapting the host organization itself. And then to make things even more challenging, we could be adapting the evaluation. So that's obviously going to introduce a lot of challenges there. I've titled the paper Fidelity to Theory, a realist perspective on implementation science to signal some of these concerns from the outset. And my main contention is this: of all the things we should prioritize in our investigations, it's theory that matters most. The quote you see here is widely accredited to Kurt Lewin, the German-American psychologist. In fact, it's become known as Lewin's maxim. And in his words, nothing is so practical as good theory. It's theory that helps us explain events, not just describe them. It's theory that helps us anticipate outcomes, not just observe them. And it's theory that enables us to make claims which are coherent, causal, and most importantly, transferable. Now, I'll be developing this argument throughout the paper, but just to give you a sense of where we're headed, the following questions provide a basic structure. First, we'll explore how fidelity has been traditionally understood in implementation science. Next, we'll examine one of the most highly cited frameworks in implementation science, the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research, or CIFA. And we'll be interested to see how it conceptualizes not just fidelity, but adaptation. And they're in a kind of tension. At least that's how the research sees it. Finally, we'll consider how realist methodology can build on frameworks like CIFA to develop theories that are causal and that can be tested empirically. And that's a crucial point. Realist methodology is based on a philosophy. It's known as scientific realism, and it applies that philosophy with fidelity. So how has fidelity been traditionally understood in implementation science? Well, if a program adhered closely to its original design, it was considered to have high fidelity. But if it deviated, then the program's effectiveness was assumed to be compromised. And it was Linda Duesenberry and colleagues in 2003 who formalized a more structured approach to program integrity. They proposed 5 dimensions for measuring it: adherence, dose, quality of delivery, participant responsiveness, and program differentiation. It's adherence, the extent to which program components are delivered as intended by program developers, that's critical for our discussion today. And the reason why is it actually sets up a nice debate between adherence and adaptation. In these early implementation models, it was program integrity that mattered most. And so adaptations were generally seen as a threat to implementation quality, as something to monitor, minimize, in some cases, even avoid. Over time, the field has evolved considerably. Adaptation is no longer viewed purely as a threat to implementation quality. In fact, under the right conditions, skillful adaptations can even enhance program effectiveness. And the emphasis really there is on under the right conditions. So the realist thinking is already starting to inform how we should think about these problems. The quote you see here is from Laura Damschroeder, the lead developer of the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Science Research. In her words, interventions can be conceptualized as having core components, the essential and indispensable elements of the intervention, and an adaptable periphery. Adaptable elements, structures, and systems related to the intervention and organization into which it's being implemented. So put simply, it's not a program's form that necessarily matters. It's not its so-called adaptable periphery. It's not its content. It's not its superficial features. It's the program's core functions. And another term that often gets used is active ingredients. It's these ingredients that are presumed to make the program work that need to be protected when we're implementing the program. And this brings us to CIFA. Now, if you're not aware, CIFA it's what's known as a determinant framework. It collates the most influential constructs or determinants from the literature into a single coherent structure. And its purpose is to help researchers identify potential barriers and facilitators to implementation. I've chosen it here for a couple of reasons. First, it's one of the most widely used frameworks, so it's familiar to policymakers. And in fact, we've used this very framework in our own work. My former colleagues and I, working as part of the HSE strategy, we use this very framework to help theorize and conceptualize how to best implement, embed, and scale effective practices across New South Wales public schools. But we had to adapt this framework considerably, which again introduces those challenges. The other reason I think this is such a critical framework is that it gives us a shared language to talk about implementation. Just remember, it's a consolidated framework. So it effectively synthesizes much of the implementation science research, which is huge. And, you know, if you look at the article itself, you'll see, you know, over several pages, a table, and it just beautifully organizes and outlines these different constructs. We'll go through them one by one. In fact, there are 39 constructs in total, and they're grouped into these 5 overarching domains: the innovation, the outer setting, the inner setting, individuals, and the implementation process itself. Just note, if you remember that early slide where I said that it's so important to conceptually distinguish between these different categories, especially for our evaluations, I think CIFA does a really nice job of keeping these different things separate for all the reasons that I touched on earlier. So let's have a look at these domains one by one. First, we have the innovation, the policy intervention or set of practices being implemented. And it includes constructs related to how the innovation is perceived, whether it's seen as evidence-based, advantageous, adaptable, or overly complex. Next, we have the outer setting. And this covers all of the social, economic, political, and competitive factors external to the organization that could influence how the implementation goes. The inner setting is the actual organization itself. It could be a school, it could be a hospital, it could even be a city. And the best way to think of what the inner setting is that it has a boundary, but of course that boundary is somewhat arbitrary. It's going to change, but it does have a boundary. In this inner setting, you'll see things like the physical layout, technology infrastructure, the composition of teams. Remember, there's 39 constructs that are distributed across this framework. And so the inner setting is looking at those things within the organization that's going to either enable or impede implementation. What's so interesting about the inner setting is that it also includes intangible items such as staff attitudes, culture, and tension for change. Next, we have the individuals, the people actually involved in implementing the innovation. And this includes people's knowledge, beliefs, and motivations, but also constructs related to things like role clarity, trust, alignment with the intervention goals. Finally, you have the implementation process itself, and these are all the activities, all of the strategies and efforts to plan for implementation, to engage with stakeholders, to deliver and, of course, adapt the program, but also evaluate its progress. So that's a really important thing to note, that evaluation is actually embedded. And in principle, you could think of evaluation being embedded across every single part of this process, potentially even within the design of innovations. So it's clearly an impressive framework as a taxonomy of key determinants. It does a really good job of bringing us this conceptual clarity, providing us with this shared language. But there are some problems, and all frameworks, of course, have their problems. The biggest issue here, and this is a point that a lot of researchers have pointed that have raised, is that even though it's a determinant framework, it doesn't actually provide a lot of insight around how these determinants actually determine anything. So causality is kind of tacit, it's kind of implied within the framework, but it's hard to know where the causality actually is. And we can have a look in terms of adaptation, specific constructs related to adaptation, just to get a sense of what I mean here. So this is now a construct out of the framework. This is one construct out of the innovation design domain. It's called adaptability, the degree to which the innovation can be modified, tailored, or refined to fit local context or needs. There's causality embedded in that statement, especially if you look at the clause structure between, the degree to which the innovation can be modified to fit local context. So there is some causality in there, but it needs to be better surfaced. This is another construct from the innovation design domain, compatibility, the degree to which the innovation fits with local workflows, systems, and processes. And then we jump over to the implementation process domain now, and we're looking at a specific construct known as adapting, the process of modifying the innovation and/or organization for optimal fit and integration. Now, as I said, there is no such thing as a perfect framework or model. All models are wrong, some are useful. But what I want to draw out now is that I think it's important to at least recognize that the causal logic in this framework needs to be surfaced somehow. It needs to be explicated. And a framework is not a methodology. We need a methodology to do this work. And this prompts some questions. Question 1. In what circumstances is adaptation necessary for successful implementation? How do implementers determine which features of a program to preserve and which to adapt? Are there situations where adaptation should be minimized or avoided altogether? And finally, in what context might strict adherence and standardization be a better option than adaptation? So these are just questions to ponder, but they're all realist informed questions. I want to thank a colleague for pointing out two frameworks that I'll just touch on, but it's in the reference list. The modify framework and MADI framework. These are frameworks that are actually devoted towards, really trying to understand how to perhaps even answer these questions. And we'll provide some answers to them in a moment. The CIFA framework, it's an organizing framework. It's serving a different purpose. These other frameworks that are out there, so MADI, Modify, perhaps even the FRAME framework, no pun intended, these are going to help you do very specific things. Now, scholars like Mitchell Sarkies have raised a similar point to what I mentioned earlier around causality. And I'll read this quote out for you. As he sees it, and he's not alone, there would be other researchers as well. Anton Kislov, for instance, makes a similar point. But as Sarkies writes, the problem with determinate frameworks like CIFA is that they often examine context separately as compiled lists of important factors. And these are not explicitly linked to why these may differ between sites, but also how they influence the social processes that impact outcomes. So let's try and just unpack that together. Sarkies is focusing specifically on context. And if you remember in CIFA, context is mostly related to the inner and outer setting. So he's talking about those constructs that are not connected to anything else in the framework. And that's a fair point. We can actually amplify that argument even further and say none of the constructs across the framework are connected in any way meaningfully. And again, this is not necessarily a criticism of CIFA because its purpose might be different. It's a consolidated framework. But the point here is that we need to, or someone needs to, continue the work of building the causality and trying to actually realize the explanatory potential of CIFA. So the problem here, as Sarkies has pointed out, is that context, it either gets decoupled from the mechanisms that cause change, or context and mechanism actually get conflated. So the point is that we'd have to get the table up and have a look at it, but it's a bit of a mess. You've got things that might be part of the intervention, things that are implementation process, things that are, from a realist perspective, mechanism, things that are to do with individuals but could be considered part of context. It's a mess. And this is not a criticism of CIFA because they're working with different, philosophical and methodological commitments. Realists take a very different look at context and mechanism. So it would be unfair to level a critique against CIFA on those grounds, but we can certainly ask the question, which is, where is the causality in CIFA? And so the problem is that when you don't connect in a clear line of causal reasoning these constructs, then causality gets elided, or it gets obfuscated, or it gets black boxed. So I'm just going to check on time. We're at about 25 minutes, I think. Robert, is that right? Okay, good. So here's the question that that all realists would be trying to answer. And in fact, anyone who's doing theory-driven evaluation is trying to answer this question. How do we open up this black box? How do we get at causality? From a realist perspective, obviously we need to stop conflating context and mechanism for the same reason that we separate the innovation from the implementation process. We also need some conceptual clarity. Otherwise, it just gets too overwhelming, too confusing. From a realist perspective, context refers to the necessary conditions that enable or constrain change. This could include leadership engagement, resource availability, interpersonal dynamics, even the policy or regulatory environment. Mechanisms, by contrast, are the shifts in people's reasoning in response to specific program resources. It's those internal shifts to reasoning. Now, just because I'm not sure what the knowledge of the audience is around realist methodology, I'm just trying to keep things as simple as possible. Jill Westhorpe is doing some very interesting work where we're finding different ways of understanding mechanism that aren't just involving those internal shifts to reasoning. And it's a fair point. This is one criticism that does get leveled against realist methodology. These mechanisms are too psychologized or too behaviorist. So there are ways to think of mechanisms as operating in different ways, different structures, different processes, different entities. You can have institutional mechanisms, you can have interpersonal mechanisms. You might have a mechanism around social pressure, for instance. I know Jill Westhorpe talks about love being a potential mechanism. So there are other ways to come at this question, but for now, let's just simplify it. Let's talk about mechanisms as being psychological in terms of shifts to people's reasoning. And this is a crucial point. It's not programs alone that generate outcomes. It's the interaction between the resources a program provides and the changes in people's reasoning that occur in response to those resources. And Ray Pawson and Nick Tilley, the founders of realist methodology, they make this very point. In their words, programs work, that is to say, have successful outcomes, only insofar as they introduce the appropriate ideas and opportunities, in other words, the mechanisms of change, to groups in the appropriate social and cultural conditions, the contexts. And there's an easier way to conceptualize this problem. You've probably seen this before. Context plus mechanism equals outcome, the CMO configuration. That's its simplest version. I think there's a last count was 7 different ways of coming at this problem. There are CMOs, there are CIMOs, context, intervention, mechanism, outcome. I saw ICAMO the other day, intervention, context, actor, mechanism, outcome. There are many ways to come about it. They're all just heuristics to come at this problem. I personally just prefer keeping it simple. Context, mechanism, outcome. And then if you wanted to, you can split mechanism into program resources, so mechanism resources, and reasoning, mechanism reasoning. And you can kind of think about it, but it doesn't really matter. These are just ways to, we're just finding ways to represent very complex things that are happening in reality. And obviously, you know, we can never fully capture what's going on here. They're just tools to help our thinking. So in the final slides, I'll just have a look here, and that's about half hour, so 10 minutes left to keep on time, Robert. Okay, good, very good. In the final slides, I'd like to show how realist thinking can be used to realize the explanatory potential of this CIFA framework. And I think it's really important that we come back to this idea of an adaptable periphery. So this is how I visually represented it, but it serves the purpose. So we can see on the outside, that's the periphery. And if you remember the core components, they're the essential theory-driven elements of the innovation. So we can see them as core, they're in the middle. The little cog there is meant to represent mechanism. And then we have this adaptable periphery on the outside. And it could include things like content, delivery method, sequence, personnel, tools and materials, and of course, setting. Just to give you some concrete examples now, let's look at the classroom. So as I said, I'm an educational researcher and evaluator, and I'm really looking at effective practice actually in the classroom. So what would some of these potential adaptable items look like? Well, let's start with content. Adapting content might involve changing names, terminology, maybe the difficulty of the language of students. Teachers might decide to, if we look at delivery method, they might decide to shift the delivery method from whole class instruction to small groups. If we look to sequence, teachers might decide to use work examples before they explicitly model their ideas, rather than using work examples after. And even personnel could be modified. So teachers might enroll and train parents to facilitate small groups. And in fact, this happens all the time. So you get the idea. We have this adaptable periphery. These are the things that are conceptualized or theorized to be adaptable, so long as they don't undermine or threaten the core logic of the program, the causal logic, why the program is doing what it's doing. But I ask the question to you, do you see any problems with this distinction between core components and adaptable periphery? What problems could there be there? And so the first question that comes to mind is that who's to say these peripheral components aren't in practice the very things that make the difference? And the researcher that I mentioned earlier, one of the adaptation frameworks, Alexis Kirk, they urge caution around this very distinction for this reason. What is core in one context, that is, what is functional, may be ineffective in another context. Conversely, what is peripheral, so what is part of the program's superficial form, may be the very thing that enables the mechanisms to fire. And a perfect example would be sequence here. The idea of using worked examples before modeling. Well, we could empirically test that. And then we could decide that, no, actually, it's really important that you verbalize and you explicitly unpack an idea, and then you show the work example after. So it all depends on context. It's for this reason that I prefer to think of adaptation as occurring along a continuum. And it's the work of Norwegian scholar Hel Arn Rovik that I find most compelling. As you can see here, Rovik offers three ideal types, three translational modes to classify how knowledge is adapted across organizational borders. First, we have the reproducing mode, which aims to produce a near replica of a program. And its logics are going to be adherence, copying, standardization. Next, we have the modifying mode, which seeks to adapt certain features to improve its fit. And its logics are going to be tailoring, experimentation, and fit. And finally, we have the reinventing mode. And this is where the entire goals, logic, structure of the program is radically transformed. Its logics are going to be reinterpretation and innovation. So the question now is methodology. This is all about methodology. These are the steps that we might take, especially if we're applying with fidelity some of these realist principles. I'm just going to go through them. We can come back to them in the discussion if you like, but I'll go through them very quickly. But just one thing I will say, realist methodology, it's combining realist research with realist evaluation. Its aim is to really try and illuminate, explicate causality, a particular idea of causality known as generative causation. But simply put, it's about building, testing, and refining theories, right? And our theories are going to be adaptation. So the first thing you might do is you want to identify your problem space. You want to identify what are the needs for adaptation. You might conduct some theory gleaning interviews with your stakeholders. You should conduct a scoping review of existing theories, frameworks, and models in the literature. I've already mentioned Modify and MADI. You will need to choose some candidate middle range theories. So Rovik is technically it's a theory. It's actually a theory from sociology, and it can be used to really help, really help build these program theories. Then you develop your initial program theories. These are often just like propositional statements, but they take different forms. You might want to run some logic modeling workshops with your stakeholders. Eventually, you're going to have to design an evaluation. It's not going to be any old evaluation. It's going to be a theory-driven evaluation. This is crucial. You want to implement your program theory with fidelity. Then you want to evaluate the adaptations. So you want to, in Gullickson's terms, fully describe for you, then fully judge. And, this is just a suggested order, but, we could have great debates about how, better ways to go about it, but the principles remain the same. And I just want to make one point now. Fidelity to theory, it's not a new idea. And I know that it seems like there's a bit of confusion here because implementation science uses fidelity in a very particular way, but, not to defer to authority too early, but people like Michael Quinn Patton talk about fidelity to principles. So we understand this, I think, intuitively. Evaluation approaches, developmental approaches, realist approaches, they all have something about them that makes them coherent. They have some principles. They have a causal theory, actually. And we want to try and be faithful to that theory as evaluators. So as evaluators, we're trying to be faithful to methodology, but the implementers need to be faithful to their program theory. Otherwise, our investigation is going to be hopelessly confused. Because I'm running out of time, we can come back to these in the discussion, but these are questions that we would want to answer, and I've had a go at trying to answer them through a quick scoping review, and certainly not a full realist review, but I do have some answers to these questions, so we can discuss them in the discussion. But yes, question 1, what conditions are needed for successful adaptation? For whom and under what circumstances is adaptation likely to work? How can implementers be supported to adapt program elements without compromising core functions? And finally, through what mechanisms will implementers be enabled to make skillful adaptations? So that brings us almost to a close. I think it's only fair that if I'm going to talk about how to do it, I should try and actually do it. This is my very, very rough initial program theory. It's called Hypothesis 1. It's trying to bring some of these ideas from the literature around adaptation together. I have no idea if it's a good hypothesis. It has not been checked with stakeholders. It has not been born out of theory gleaning interviews. It's based on my own thinking while doing this presentation. And in truth, you would want to come up with about 30 of these. So I'll just give you a moment to read this hypothesis. And again, we can come back to this if you like. So that's my argument. Hopefully, I've been able to convince you why we need fidelity to theory, but just to reiterate, every program has causal assumptions. And if we don't fully explicate, fully describe those causal assumptions, and then implement those assumptions or that theory faithfully, then we're not going to be clear about our evaluations. And this goes for evaluators as well. We also need to be faithful to theory, but the theory that we'll be faithful to is methodology. And it's together that we're really trying to understand how the theory is actually working in practice. And that's how we can develop a better understanding of causality. And this brings us to an end. I just want to acknowledge some of the excellent feedback and advice that I had in putting this together. I really want to call out the HSC strategy team as part of our work with the New South Wales Department of Education. This team was led by Liam Downing, and you see here, this is the HSC Strategy Academic Partner Project. This is available, it's publicly available, and I think it's an exemplar of how to do good evaluation. One of the incredible things about the work that we did. We were part of what's known as a program incubator for effective practice, but it was an incubator of so much more. It was also an incubator of new ways of thinking and applying evaluation. So please have a look at that report if you want to see how these ideas were applied. And a lot of this research was both came from the HSC strategy, and then it was also used to inform the HSC strategy. Thank you, and stop there.
Thanks, Andrew. That was terrific. I really appreciated how you've helpfully and engagingly stepped us through a number of those different frameworks and the literature there in this space. And certainly, I think for the first time for me, opening my eyes to the range of considerations there, and so certainly welcome everyone to jump in and join the discussion now with their questions or thoughts, and just while they're perhaps considering or composing those, I thought what was interesting to me is looking at the CIFA framework and going, but I can relate to some of those things coming up in evaluations I've done before, but then sort of reflecting on it going, but they've probably come up because we've stumbled upon them rather than actually having a deliberate intent to examine, as said, what's actually happening causally within the implementation. So I think really valuable frameworks to draw on a lot more deliberately in our evaluations. One particular question I had was in the individual's domain. I think you talked particularly about it being about the people involved in implementing. Does this include the participants, or where do they fit in the framework, and what about participants themselves is considered in the framework?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the individuals usually will be, another term we could use is the implementers. So that can bring a little bit of conceptual clarity. But then from an evaluation perspective, they'll be part of our evaluation. So they'll be also participants as well. But yeah, we would want to distinguish between innovation designers and the implementers. Where it gets tricky is when the implementers are actually also designing the innovations, which is fine. We can handle that, but we would need to make that very clear in our logic models.
And then what about those then that the innovation is reaching? So if you're using, education as a setting, what about the students in the classroom? How are they considered from an implementation perspective?
Yeah, that is an excellent question. Obviously it's an easy question for an evaluator to answer because it'll be part of the outcomes, presumably, right? Like a teaching program will be wanting to do many things, but surely one thing it'll want to do is to improve certain outcomes for students. They might be academic outcomes, they might be well-being outcomes, could be anything. And so where are the students, or where are the recipients or beneficiaries in CIFA? I don't think they're in CIFA, actually. I'd have to go back and check. We would need to, yeah, make sure that they're absolutely prioritized in our evaluations. And this is where things get complex. So in the logic models that we've used before, they're quite large. We have to use interactive whiteboards because they just sprawl. Like it's a implementation chain that can go from innovation design through to scaling across thousands of public schools. And so when you're always thinking about your implementation chain, you're going to narrow in on certain things, and some of your outcomes might have nothing to do, in this case, with students. It might be firmly focused on teachers, or maybe it could be focused on policymakers because policymakers need to make an authorizing environment. But yes, we do need to think very carefully about the people that we're trying to create change in. And at some point, they would, yeah, you would have to think very, very carefully about how your different, I will use your term, like participants, policymakers, school principals, teachers, parents, community members, and students, how they're fitting in within your evaluation designs. Great. Thanks, Robin.
Thanks, Andrew. So yeah, we've got a couple of people to come to in the discussion. So just firstly, there are a couple of comments, certainly agreeing and loving the distinction between adaptable periphery and the core, and needing to be careful about doing so according to context, and very helpful ideas for developing a theory of change that could be used either to design or evaluate the program. Carly's also taken up your invitation to hear some of your possible answers to those 4 questions you posed in the slides. Because you might go back into the slides for those, just maybe before we do that, I see Philip's got his hand up, so I might come to you first, Philip, and then go to those 4 questions on the slide.
Thanks very much, Robert. And first of all, congratulations, Andrew. I thought that was a terrific presentation for some really complicated ideas and bringing those to the space where we can really engage with them. So thanks a lot for that work. And I just want to pick up on what Sue Finol's put into the chat there as well. I agree this is really interesting work about not just clarifying what this idea of the adaptable periphery and the core is, but then problematizing that and introducing the idea of Rovik's continuum. And I'm interested if you could speak just a little bit more about how that continuum helps to guard against or overcome this problem, because the core periphery distinction you were talking about seems to just fall into a problem of not being able to tell the difference between the context and the setting, as it were, or the significant effect of changing one of those so-called peripheral elements might have on the extent to which an identified mechanism would or wouldn't fire. So how does that Rovik continuum actually address that, or is that how you're proposing to address that problem?
Yeah, thank you, Phil. Might actually be just for everyone, might be helpful if we just go back quickly to Rovik's continuum.
I'm so glad you did, because the cat really was one of my favorite bits of the presentation. So great.
Yes, this cat happens to be a little overnourished, but nonetheless, yeah, not quite a replication of my own cat. So Phil, can you see translational modes? Yep, okay, great. So I really like this continuum. And if we come back to this adaptable periphery, here it is here. No, here it is here. The adaptable periphery, there it is. Okay, great. It's just a metaphor, so we shouldn't be too harsh with people's attempts to use metaphors. We all need metaphors. We all rely on metaphors. I think the main issue is that sometimes it can be a bit static. That's like some of the criticism made, that there's always going to be this core component that's never going to change. You've got an adaptable periphery. You can do what you like with that adaptable periphery, but you know, as long as you can preserve those core components, you'll be fine. And the problem there, as we discussed, is that there's no way of knowing if something in an adaptable periphery is causal or not until you're putting it in practice and testing it and talking to people and observing things and doing your evaluations. Something really superficial, like the language that you use, which is an example that gets used all the time for adaptable periphery. Oh, you just change the language, you make it more culturally sensitive, or you make it more user-friendly language, for instance. Just well, that could be the thing that makes the difference in what you're looking at. So the metaphors themselves, they're okay. I think form and function's a bit better. I know it's just a slight change, but form and function's a bit better, because now you're starting to push function a bit further. You're pushing the thing that makes it work. You're thinking about form, and you just got to be very loose about how you think of form. The form is always context dependent, but it's Rovik's continuum that I think is just beautiful, because then it just simplifies the whole problem. I'll just give the example that he uses. A fast food franchise would have a program theory, and its theory would be very much a reproducing mode. Maybe it's got outcomes around, I don't know, consistency of customer service, but it's going to be standardized. It's going to have quality control measures. It's going to have all of these things built into it. And so we can think of that as being minimal transformation. Most teaching programs or educational programs are going to involve adaptation. Some might even involve radical reinvention, but then it gets hard because the stakes, Helen Timperley talks about adaptive expertise. The demands for adaptive expertise are going to be even more, amplified or pronounced when you're reinventing things. It's hard enough to adapt, but yes, most educational programs are going to fall somewhere in this continuum. And I like the continuum because you don't have to worry too much about core, periphery. Some parts of your program will have highest fidelity, things that you're really protecting. Other parts of your program, if you're thinking in Jagosh's program architecture, might allow for radical reinvention. And it doesn't matter. It all just needs to come into the logic model. Even if your implementers change halfway through and say, hey, we really valued reproducing, but now we actually think we need to heavily start adapting things, that's fine. Just got to fully describe, get it into the program theory so that we can together fully judge. I'm happy to leave slides up, and then Robert, yeah, any other questions that people might have, but I can't see the chat anymore.
No, that's great. Thank you. And I thought the fast food example is a really relatable one. But even if you think about that, certainly in the business models now, there's parts that, are very much focused on reproducing, but then they do modify, and specifically for that reason, adapt the source to improve fit. So they have country-specific menu items and things like that now for McDonald's across the world. And so that to your point, you can see it's not a strict adherence to either we're, adapting or not, but there's that continuum there. Just the other slide to come to was on those 4 questions, and they're interested to hear about your possible answers in our last few minutes.
Yeah, so these are very tentative at this stage, because we would need to do a full review, but some tentative ideas. What conditions are needed for adaptation? Obviously, the contexts need to differ either significantly or enough from the original context where the innovation was made, or your implementers are going to be innovating or developing the thing itself within their context. But that's the first condition. You need different contexts. There are some other things you'll need, and this kind of encroaches into some of the other questions, but your implementers and designers are going to have a strong understanding of the local context, which really means a theory. They need to understand, they need to have a theory about how contextual factors in the institution, interpersonal relations, infrastructure, and within individuals are all causally related. And you want a supportive organizational environment for doing adaptation. Let's have a look at the next one. For whom and under what circumstances is adaptation likely to work? I'll answer this quickly. Let's use teachers as an example. Teachers who have real expertise, deep expertise. Teachers who value their expertise and might find departments, telling them how to prescriptively teach something as an imposition to their professional judgment. So they value adapting. They think that adapting is important. They're good at adapting. And then within the schools, you would have maybe structures like a community of practice, because adaptation is hard. And we're going to get into the next question, which is around support. How can implementers be supported? Adaptation is hard. It's going to involve a lot of sense making. You want good communities of practice set up or some other forum. You might want actual professional development around adaptation itself. You might, you're going to have to develop adaptation teams. We can call them implementation teams or whatever, it doesn't matter, but you need teams that are good at doing it. You absolutely need an evaluation. And in fact, not just any evaluation, but a responsive evaluation, because you've got to document what you're adapting to then know how those adaptations are actually influencing things. Obviously, you need a clear specification of, the things that you can't compromise on and the things that maybe you can. A good example is realist methodology. A core function or core part of realist methodology would be generative mechanism. You can't compromise on that. You can't use counterfactual reasoning in realist methodology, but maybe you can adapt other things around the methods that you use. And in fact, realism is methods agnostic anyway. Last one. These are again, we're just going to focus on internal shifts to reasoning, beliefs, motivation, confidence. Well, maybe it's clarity around, how to, like, what to add, what to replace, what to delete, what to amplify, what to tone down. Maybe there's some ownership. So certain teachers who value their expertise in adaptation, then they're going to have ownership over the programs. That could be a mechanism. That could be a mechanism for increasing motivation. You'll need those structured reflection opportunities like communities of practice to support adaptive expertise. And then finally, you'll need some feedback mechanisms happening either through the evaluation or the implementation process. But I will stop there because I know we're out of time. And Robert, I'll hand it back to you.
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks everyone for your participation today. Yeah, certainly plenty of thanks and appreciation in the chat. Phil, I think, echoes many of us our thoughts, saying he's looking forward to seeing this in print. And I know that this is an evolution from a conference paper last year, but so not to add the pressure onto you, but yes, I think this is something that people will continue to look forward to engaging, a topic they'll continue to look forward to engaging in. So thanks again, everyone, and have a terrific rest of your day.